All right. Welcome to those who are joining us today. Just a quick reminder to get optimum performance from today's presentation, upper right-hand corner under the view settings, if you would select that to speaker view, that would be ideal, such that whenever the panel members are speaking, you'll see them. And of course, hear their audio at all times as well. And we appreciate you joining us here today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tobias McFall, co-president of the Canada Texas Chamber of Commerce. Today's event, our first in a series of live online events, what a Biden presidency means for North America. We'd like to first take a moment before we get right into it and talk about the CTCC, or the Canada Texas Chamber of Commerce. We are made up of a group of advisory board members, myself being from the firm of Weinstein and Speer, the cross-border tax advisory silo within our group. We also have several other members that are part of our board of advisor in alphabetical order. Delon Chan from the Consul General of Canada. One second, we lost screens here for a second. There we go. Brian Ensler with BMO Harris Bank. Ken Harder from Dunbar Harder. Just a second here. Dan Yankovic from Blake's Canadian Lawyers. Noah Kruger from Savills. Doug McCullough from McCullough Sudan. Jim Michalski from Cole International. Dina Santos also from the Consul General of Canada. And James Savage. So we appreciate everyone's participation today. We'd also like to highlight a couple of our advisory board companies that I didn't mention, including Air Canada and Bechtel. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Doug McCullough to introduce and moderate our panel today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to introduce our two panelists. Clark Packard is a resident fellow in Trade Policy Council in the Finance, Insurance, and Trade Policy Department at the R Street Institute. Clark joined the R Street from the National Taxpayers Union, where he spearheaded the organization's work on trade and financial services policy and provided legal counsel to the organization's senior officers. Previously, he was an attorney and policy advisor for 2 South Carolina governors. Early in his career, Clark worked in private legal practice where he advised financial services companies on federal and state financial regulation. Sean Speer is an assistant professor in public policy at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's also the project co-director of the Ontario 360 Research Project at the Munk School. Sean Speer is currently fellow in residence and Prime Minister of Canada Fellow at the Public Policy Forum. He previously served as a senior economic advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So Clark and Sean, thank you so much for being part of the panel today.
Thanks for having us.
So I don't think that we can really have a conversation about what the Biden administration means for North American trade without a little bit of historic confidence. So the question I'm going to have for both of you is, give us, from your perspective, a little bit of a historical context of where we are coming into this moment in 2021, and I'll sort of leave it to you whether that historical context is looking back 4 years or if it's back to pre-NAFTA days. But Sean, why don't you start and give us just a little bit of context of where we are, sort of leading up to this moment.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks to the group for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. For those of you joining the conversation, in terms of the historical context, let me just make a couple of quick points, and then I'd be curious to hear Clark's perspective. I think that it's broadly accepted in Canada that there has been a kind of lack of urgency and momentum around the Canada-U.S. relationship predating the Trump administration. I mean, people participating in today's session won't be surprised to hear that the bilateral relationship was affected by the Trump administration. But I think to minimize the issues as merely a manifestation of the Trump administration's perspective on America's role in the world, questions around trade and so on, I think would be to miss the longer period of time in which there's been, I think, just a lack of urgency, a degree of complacency, and I think a concern that we've reached a bit of a stasis in terms of the broader agenda around continental integration and our binational economic relationship. One could kind of pinpoint different factors that have contributed to that kind of degree of complacency and sense that some of the progress that followed the NAFTA in the 90s and then the SPP in the early 2000s. But I think it's fair to say that the Canadian government, Canadian policymakers, Canadian businesses have felt like that progress has stalled. Part of it is that the Obama administration had a kind of primary focus on its domestic agenda, and I don't think placed a great deal of political attention or emphasis on the binational relationship. There were, I think, at the level of executive, I think, differing political and ideological perspectives between the Harper government, of which I was part, and the Obama administration, and those differences manifested themselves on key binational issues like the Keystone XL project, for instance. And of course, those issues only were exacerbated by the Trump administration's poise vis-a-vis Canada, both on the issue of the renegotiation of NAFTA, but a broader set of binational issues, including the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum, and of course the issue that continues to persist with respect to the Huawei CFO and the two Canadians that are continue to be held unlawfully by the Chinese regime. So that's a long way of saying, Doug, that well before the inauguration of the Biden administration, I think there is a sense in Canada that the relationship, that some of the progress and the promise of the 90s and early 2000s is stalled. And well, at the kind of commercial and business level, we continue to see significant collaboration and engagement, including, of course, through our extraordinary network of supply chains. I think that that there's been a long sense that there's a need to kind of reinvigorate the degree of binational agenda setting, policy making, and governmental cooperation. And we can talk a bit about what that may look like going forward, but I think that's a reasonable synopsis of the state of the relationship from the Canadian perspective.
Yeah, I would, to jump in here a little bit, I would tend to agree with that maybe the relationship, there was a certain amount of lethargy in the relationship. But I do think, the Obama administration really prioritized pivoting, the phrase was pivoting toward Asia. And so that sort of brings me to the Trump administration, right? The Obama administration was pushing hard for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then one of the first things the Trump administration did, in fact, their first official action was to withdraw the United States from the TPP. Mexico and Canada obviously moved forward with that. And had the United States moved forward with that, we wouldn't have needed to renegotiate NAFTA. It served as a modernization of NAFTA. Sean touched on the national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. Obviously, those were completely bogus, right? Like, you know, Canadian steel and aluminum are not a national security threat to the United States. And frankly, it's pretty offensive to think that it is, or think that they would be. And, you know, I think that really sort of soured the relationship. I remember Prime Minister Trudeau on Meet the Press shortly thereafter, you know, really upset about that. I was at the Canadian Embassy shortly thereafter, talking with the economics department there. And it really was sort of shocking. And obviously those tariffs stayed in place until it became apparent that they were a potential roadblock to getting the new NAFTA or the USMCA done. And, you know, obviously this is just one part of that relationship, but the Trump administration also, you know, took a really aggressive posture toward Mexico, the third partner in this relationship. At various points threatened to completely shut down the border or impose tariffs in response to immigration. So I think that, you know, in a lot of respects, the relationship may have been suffering sort of on the back burner for a while, but I really think that the Trump administration, and it wasn't just Canada, right? It was an antipathy toward any foreign country that wasn't just going to bend over backwards to accommodate a U.S. agenda. So I take Sean's point. I think that's right, but I also think that President Trump sort of supercharged a lot of those feelings. And my hope is, I'm sort of, you know, bullish on this relationship moving forward, but it needs to be as part of a broader U.S. rethinking of how the United States is going to engage the world commercially. In particular, I'll leave the foreign policy and the you know, national security stuff to others, but I am sort of bullish on this relationship, and I really hope that the Biden administration can sort of pivot back and reaffirm this relationship. But that's not to minimize some things that I assume we'll discuss later, which are very serious frictions that exist that predate Donald Trump and predate President Biden. There are very serious frictions that need to be resolved and have been sort of lingering for a long time.
So may I just elaborate for 1 minute on Clark's observations, which I wholeheartedly agree with. To the extent to which there was a silver lining to the Trump administration's more aggressive posture vis-a-vis Canada, is I'd like to think that it's and many of those participating in today's discussion who are on the front lines of these issues will be aware of this. I think it caused the Canadian government, the Canadian business community, and other Canadian stakeholders to kind of up our collective game with respect to how we think about engagement in the American context. We saw kind of coordinated efforts at the governmental, business, and broader stakeholder level, both engaging obviously with the administration, but with key members of Congress. And I think most promisingly at the subnational level, where the asymmetry between the two countries can change, and where I think Canada has a powerful story to tell with respect to the importance of the Canadian market for more than half American states, which call Canada its most important, who call Canada their most important export market. So, I think one of the questions that remains open in Canada is whether that urgency and momentum around kind of building that capacity for binational engagement will endure now that the immediate threat posed by the Trump administration to our commercial relationship is gone. One hopes and that the Canada-Texas Chamber of Commerce and your kind of broader network could kind of help to ensure that level of sophisticated engagement continues as we move into this next stage of engagement. And as Clark says, have to continue to tackle both a series of pre-existing questions and hopefully a broader set of questions around a modernized and renewed continental engagement.
So my next question is for Clark. Joe Biden has been in politics for quite a long time. And so based on what you know of his background, his personal philosophy, and maybe even like statements on the campaign trail and his appointments, can you give just a high level description of what Joe Biden's sort of orientation is towards trade, what his philosophy is, and then maybe I'll dig down just a little bit deeper into what his trade priorities are likely to be?
Sure. That's a good question. I wrote a piece about a year ago when it became apparent that Biden was going to be the nominee, that basically said free traders should breathe a sigh of relief with Joe Biden winning the Democratic nomination over Bernie Sanders. If you go back throughout history and look at Biden's record, like you said, there's a lot there. But on major questions, he's been, in my opinion, on the right side of those issues. So he voted for NAFTA. He voted for the US, or the precursor to NAFTA, the US-Canadian Free Trade Agreement. He voted for the World Trade Organization agreements and to admit China into the World Trade Organization. All of those, I think, were good ideas. He has flirted with protectionism. He has supported things like steel quotas in the past. But, by and large, he's within that broad sort of middle in the United States, which for, 60, 70 years paid tremendous dividends, which is generally predisposed toward more engagement economically across borders. But with certain caveats. So he voted against the CAFTA, the U.S. trade agreement with South America. So there are sort of minor quibbles around the margin, but ultimately I think that he'll be within that broad center that generally supports globalization and the tearing down of trade barriers. Now, again, with certain exceptions, and I'm certain we'll get into those.
And so sort of my related question for Sean is, what's sort of both your personal perception, as a Canadian of Joe Biden, what you sort of expect his policies to be towards Canada, but also, to the extent that you are comfortable doing so, what's sort of been almost the man on the street response of what, in terms of trade, what the Canadian view might be on Joe Biden and his administration?
Well, participants won't be surprised to hear that President Trump's approval ratings in Canada were lower than his approval ratings in America. So, I think it's fair to say that the Canadian population as a whole was relieved by Mr. Biden's election. And the Canadian government, I think, similarly was relieved. I think that that second point is worth elaborating on for just 1 second. Doug, we've talked about this before. Think of poor Mr. Trudeau. He's elected in October 2015 with this ambitious kind of progressive agenda focused on expansion of the Canadian welfare state in different areas. A kind of bold and ambitious agenda around with respect to infrastructure and several other key areas. But his honeymoon only lasts for a few weeks because Mr. Trump's elected in November, and suddenly many of those domestic-oriented priorities are superseded by this crucial question of how the Canadian government is going to manage the binational relationship in light of this kind of fundamental threat posed by the Trump administration. People will know that former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who is widely seen as whose government is widely seen as having strong relationships both with the Reagan administration and then the administration of George H.W. Bush, famously says that the Canadian Prime Minister has two principal responsibilities. The first is to maintain national unity, and the second is to maintain good, positive bilateral relationship with the American administration. And so, I can't help but think that poor Mr. Trudeau he barely had time to kind of celebrate his victory before he was confronted with this kind of fundamental threat to both his domestic agenda and then obvious the economic and commercial interests of the country. So for that reason, I'm sure that the Canadian government was equally as relieved as the Canadian population about Mr. Biden's victory. The other thing worth emphasizing along these lines is because the Trudeau government has a self-image as a progressive government. In fact, I think probably would have seen itself as the kind of leader of progressive politics in the advanced world prior to Mr. Biden's election. There's tremendous, not just ideological, intellectual overlap, but personnel overlap. People around President Biden were involved in the Canadian Liberal Party's re-election in 2019. The Trudeau team has had in the past strong relationships with folks at the Center for American Progress, and so there's both a kind of ideological and a kind of human degree of overlap and kind of symbiotic relationship between these two administrations. So all this to say, I think both at the governmental level and at the population level, people were pleased with Mr. Biden's election, and I think see it as an opportunity to kind of move beyond some of these issues that Clark has raised in the context of the Trump administration.
And just to follow up on that, during the Trump years, one of the things I saw sort of in the Canadian press and so forth was this idea of diversification and really the idea of, as I understood it, is diversification away from relying on trade with the United States. Do you hear that as much, or was that really mostly response to the Trump years, or is that still something that is a concern?
It's a great question. The story of trade diversification in Canada goes back to the early 1970s when Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was Prime Minister, and the government pursued what was then known as the third option policy, with the goal of trying to diversify a greater share of Canadian exports from the American market elsewhere, and that was tied up in a moment of economic nationalism brought on by our centennial anniversary in 67, aversion to the Vietnam War and so on. And that idea of a third option or trade diversification, as you say, took on kind of heightened interest during the Trump administration. And part of that was a reflection of the public's animus towards President Trump and his administration and the administration's poise vis-a-vis Canada. But a kind of related factor was the Trudeau government's own predispositions to Asia in general and China in particular. And I'd love to get into this further, Doug, but I think it's fair to say, for a whole host of reasons, the prospect of deeper engagement with China has been put on ice. And so I think that presents an opportunity for a kind of renewed commitment to the binational relationship between Canada and the U.S., which I think represents a kind of exciting moment. And the question, of course, is at the governmental level, at the business level, at the civil society level, how do we seize it and break out of the complacency that I was referring to in my first answer?
Right. I know China is definitely the elephant in the room, and we'll get to it. I can recall that 2 years ago I would attend panels on NAFTA negotiations, and you could have 4 eloquent speakers talk about everything about cross-border trade, and all of the questions from the audience would always be about China. So we'll touch on China in just a moment, but I think that Clark may be ready to litigate some of those remaining issues between the U.S. and Canada. So I guess Clark, what are some of those frictions that you had in mind?
Yeah, I think Sean's point is right, but certainly I think there's going to be more predictability and it'll be a more cordial relationship. But we shouldn't minimize very serious fundamental problems and frictions that exist. Now, ultimately, those are minor in comparison with what I think is the elephant in the room, as you said, which is the issue of China. But look, Sean touched on this earlier, but the Keystone Pipeline is a big deal. I'm not surprised that the Biden administration, I guess, withdrew from it. That's been a long-term problem or issue that the Democratic Party in the United States has opposed the construction of Keystone, and Republicans have traditionally supported it. So I'm not surprised that there was a shift there. Look, we've been dealing with softwood lumber issues since 1982. I'm sure Sean can remember that debate going on when he was working for Prime Minister. And look, there have been 4 or 5 cases that have been litigated in the United States over softwood lumber imports. The U.S. claims that Canada and subnational governments basically dump the product, subsidize the product with a lower than market rates stumpage fee, and then dump the product in the United States. We just, I guess, back in November, the United States just imposed about a 9% tariff, anti-dumping countervailing duties tariff on softwood lumber imports. Obviously those tariffs will increase the cost of building a house. They hurt Canadian exporters. So there's that issue. There's the issue, the United States made a big deal out of breaking into the Canadian dairy market. That was something that the Trump administration touted a lot. And now there's a dispute between the United States and Canada over, I guess, the allocation of some tariff rate quotas. Essentially, the United States is arguing that those quotas were allocated to processors rather than producers, which is essentially banned U.S. products. I completely understand that that's a tricky political subject. The United States has plenty of these issues where we really are concerned about import competition. So those are some sort of long-standing concerns. I would highlight 2 newer concerns. Right as Biden came in, they signed a new executive order on Buy America for public procurement projects. I think that that's a bad idea for a number of reasons, but in the past, when the Obama administration signed the stimulus package in 2009, Canada was granted a waiver under the Buy American provisions. And then last night, it became apparent that was a similar waiver wasn't going to be granted this time around. Now, maybe there might be some waivers for specific sectors, but overall, the U.S. is in this Buy American mindset, which I find troubling, but I'm not surprised per se. And then a newer issue that I think is coming down the pipe. Canada has joined a number of countries that are imposing digital services taxes, essentially trying to tax major American technology firms, global multinational companies, specifically Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple. And look, the United States is engaged in sort of a back and forth with France right now over this. I know that most countries, Canada included, would like to see the United States come to the table at the OECD, develop some sort of common rules on minimum global tax or how you allocate certain profits derived in Canada and other countries, how you would tax those issues. I have concerns that by targeting specific American companies, like the French proposal, for example, I think that potentially violates certain World Trade Organization commitments. It looks like a de facto tariff to me and sort of discriminates against American companies only. So I think that's a major issue. And look, the Biden administration has said that they want to negotiate at the OECD. That's the appropriate venue to do this. But until then, I'm skeptical about this idea. I think that, again, it potentially causes certain trade frictions. But ultimately, I think that all of these issues can be managed in a more cordial way. But again, we shouldn't minimize their importance. But again, ultimately, I do think the bigger issue is China, and we can obviously discuss that later.
Just to jump in for a moment, I want to get to Sean on sort of what he might see as some open friction issues, and certainly on the Buy American issue in particular. But Clark, can you, just to give us a little bit more detail on the Buy American policies, what all does that involve? Is that primarily on governmental procurement, or what all? How far does that broad is that?
Yeah, it's essentially at this point what they're talking about is any sort of public procurement project requiring that parts and all components be made in the United States. It's pretty far-reaching, but look, in the United States should be prepared for retaliation from our trading partners. The United States would rightly complain about a Buy Canadian provision. And I'm just concerned that if the United States goes down this road, obviously you're not getting as much bang for your buck on the procurement project, but it also triggers retaliation, and American construction firms would be rightly angry about that. I think service providers, increasingly, I think too much about trading goods, but increasingly, I think with the digitalization of the economy, it's moving in a direction toward trade and services. And I think that the U.S. companies can provide services for government procurement projects all around the world. And we're potentially closing ourselves off from that market by pursuing this really bad policy in the United States.
So Sean, I'll let you comment on what you see as various items of friction, but certainly comment on the Buy American proposals.
Sure, I'll be as brief as I can, Doug. I think Clark's characterization, though, of how to think about the state of the bilateral relationship is precisely right. In fact, there's been a series of Canadian commentaries in our newspapers and elsewhere that, if I can capture it in a single phrase, it's something like two cheers for the Biden administration. That is to say, things are better, but there remains these outstanding questions that, notwithstanding the change at the top of the American government, are not going to suddenly disappear. And I think the most powerful expression of that, of course, was the cancellation of the Keystone permit. I must say I'm not naive about the domestic political conditions on this file, but I was struck, and I think a lot of Canadians were struck by the extent to which this was one of the first acts of the Biden administration. It did seem like a bit of a peculiar priority, and it has caused some friction within Canada, particularly at the subnational level, where the government of Alberta has been active and outspoken. One thing that may be self-evident to participants, but is still worth emphasizing, is one can't help but think that notwithstanding the kind of political reaction from the government of Alberta, the politics of this are probably not bad for the Trudeau government. Oil sands development is a fault line within its own party, both the members of the governing caucus and as well as its own party membership. And so the extent to which this project doesn't proceed through the actions of someone else, like the Biden administration, is probably net good politics for the Trudeau government, at least within its own voter coalition. But I think you'll continue to see the government of Alberta beat the drum on this issue, and I know there's been talk of possibly pursuing appeals through the NAFTA process and so on. On the couple of other issues that Clark raised, Buy America is obviously one that has been a longstanding kind of irritant at different times between the two countries. I guess we'll wait to see. As Clark says, we seem to have a signal that, well, we're not going to get a holus bolus exemption. There'll be exemptions at a sectoral level, and I guess at the end of the day, we'll have to kind of piece those together and see in the aggregate whether it amounts to how close it amounts to a full exemption or something approximating a full exemption. I'm not sure. I'm intrigued by Clark's observations about the digital sales tax. That's fascinating that it's kind of reaching the level of interest amongst American trade policy experts. There is, in Canada, it's part of a kind of broader policy debate about Canadian culture and the transition from a kind of conventional broadcasting model to these new forms of digital streaming. What's fascinating for folks participating, our Excise Tax Act, in effect, the Canadian sales tax statute, requires that firms with a substantial presence in Canada charge and remit sales tax. And the truth is, Amazon has had for some time a presence in Canada that met that threshold. So where other jurisdictions may have been at this issue earlier than Canada because of the so-called Amazon question, we were relieved of that because Amazon has a series of fairly significant distribution centers. So the whole question of digital sales tax is not being driven by Amazon and an asymmetry between Amazon and bricks and mortar retailers in Canada. It really is being driven by our broadcasters who our traditional broadcasters who continue to raise concerns that Netflix isn't responsible or isn't required to charge or remit the Canadian sales tax, or isn't responsible to contribute to a domestic kind of cultural fund that the conventional broadcasters are. So, it's fascinating. I'd love Clark to talk more about that because it's less of a kind of competitiveness and trade issue, or at least it's conceived of in Canada. It's much more wrapped up in questions of Canadian culture, Canadian broadcasting, which has been part and parcel of the Canadian policy debate for some time, given the kind of overwhelming influence of American cultural products and institutions. I guess just the last thing I'll say, Doug, is we are taking, Canadian policymakers, Canadian businesses have taken tremendous interest in the supply chain review launched by the Biden administration. I think that it's seen both as an opportunity and a threat. And I think one of the things that Canadian policymakers and no doubt Canadian businesses are thinking about is how to engage at the administration level and at the corporate level to ensure that the outcome of that review is expansion of bilateral, commercial engagement, as opposed to a new source of trade irritant between the two countries.
Yeah, if I could touch on that just really quickly, I think Sean's exactly right. It's something that I've talked about a lot, that if the United States has serious and legitimate concerns about supply chain security, the answer to that is not reshoring everything. It's trying to develop supply chains outside of China or outside of pick a country that you have concerns about. And there's sort of a positive way to address that, deepening relationships with Canada, ensuring that hey, we can get supplies from our allies. And then there's a sort of a negative way of thinking about that, which is, oh, we're going to reshore the bulk of the supply chain for X, Y, and Z product and bring it back to the United States. And I think that that's a really misguided idea. There was a Wall Street Journal article a couple weeks ago. We're facing this significant shortage of microchips right now. And a lot of those plants are actually where Doug is in Texas. And so, the Wall Street Journal, the opening paragraph talked about, well, those were shut down. Those plants were shut down because of the storm, contributing to an already diminished supply of those microchips. So again, the answer is to build redundancies outside of the United States to make a more resilient supply chain. But if there are, and I trust me, I really firmly believe there are legitimate concerns with, being reliant on China, for example, then build supply chains around that and sort of wall them off, but don't use this as a pretext for protectionism. And that's my biggest concern, is that the Biden administration would be predisposed toward using this as a pretext for more protectionism, when the right answer is to deepen ties between the United States and Canada, United States and the EU, or what have you.
Right, and I think that we've sort of danced all around China in the conversation. And so, I think if we're honest, I think we all know that Biden's #1 trade policy is going to be addressing China, not renegotiating the USMCA or anything along those lines. So this is really a question for both of you. What are the, from sort of a, I think a term that I've heard Sean uses, continentalism, from sort of a North American perspective. What are the opportunities, if you will, of collaborating on policy towards China? And do we think it's realistic that there really will be a sort of united front, if you will? Clark, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. Look, I think that there, for the first 10 or 15 years that China joined the World Trade Organization, so 2000 to 2010, 2012, maybe with the rise of Xi in 2012, there was an awareness that hey, the Chinese economic model may pose significant problems for the world trading system, but our belief is it will move in sort of a market-oriented democratic capitalist way. I think those dreams and thoughts are now completely diminished, right? I think it's apparent that they are not going to move in a liberalizing direction. And there are a number of factors for that, but a lot of the sort of more Panglossian predictions proved to be false. I think you're right that the Biden administration, this is the issue for them, figuring out how they're going to manage that relationship. And with all due respect to my guests or the viewers here in Canada, I think the most important relationship in the world right now exists between the United States and China. In terms of global peace and prosperity, I think it really is the most important. How these countries can manage that relationship will determine a lot about what happens in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I spend a lot of time thinking about China. I have a 35-page paper coming out on next Tuesday on the issue of economics with China. And again, I do think that they are the biggest threat to the rules-based trading system, to liberalization in general. I think a lot of this has to do at the nexus of trade, technology, and national security in particular. But yeah, I mean, Canada can and will be a strong partner with us in that, obviously the Huawei CFO fighting extradition is a big issue, but Canada has signaled that it's willing to go along with the Clean Networks initiative that the United States is pushing to kind of push out Huawei and potential Chinese competitors in that space. Look, more than 50 countries in the world signed on to the Clean Networks initiative, the principles undergirding that. That's 2/3 of global GDP. Europe is essentially on board. There are certain countries that are less willing to come along. But ultimately, I think that the US and Canada can be, proactive about this and sort of tackle legitimate problems. But yeah, I think it's complicated. And again, I'd love to hear Sean's thoughts on how Canada can sort of work with the United States to sort of, put pressure on China to make changes to its economic model.
Doug, before I look forward, it's worth dwelling just a moment on where we've come from. Many participating today are acute followers of Canadian politics, Canadian economics, and so on. But it's just hard to overstate how destabilizing the past couple of years have been on these issues. I mean, think about it for a minute. Our first and arguably second or at worst third largest trading partners are engaged in a kind of growing great power competition, and Canadian public, Canadian policymakers, Canadian business feel increasingly like we're stuck between our first and third largest trading partner. And I'm, my credentials as an American file, I'd put up against any Canadians. But I got to tell you, it was challenging for the Canadian government to honor our commitments under the Extradition Treaty, which we did without question, and then to have the Trump administration basically neglect any calls to support, any calls in support of Canada or Canadians who've been unlawfully detained by the Chinese in response to us honoring our bilateral commitment to the United States. I think, setting aside kind of commercial issues, it seems to me that that was a kind of affront to Canadian sense of fairness and just our idea that we have a kind of special relationship with the United States that transcends, individual trade irritants and so on. And so that's a long way of saying, setting aside all of the issues we've talked about so far, that we'll need to make progress on with respect to our commercial relationship. I think one of the most promising signs that that the Biden administration represents a kind of path forward is the strong position it's taken, both in the communique between our two leaders and the Secretary of State in a round of Canadian media last weekend in support of Canada's position vis-a-vis China and the circumstances facing the two Canadian citizens detained. I can't kind of overstate how destabilizing the lack of support for the Trump administration on that file was at a kind of political, but even frankly, kind of a psychological level for Canada. Separate but related, what's interesting, Doug, is I think that this experience has put an end for the foreseeable future to progress on what was broadly seen as the need for Canada to broaden its economic and commercial relationship with China. It's easy to forget, but that in 2016, the Trudeau government was speaking openly about the prospect of a bilateral free trade agreement with China. That is dead in the water. Canadian level of animus towards China, I've seen proprietary polling, matches or exceeds the level of animus and skepticism in the United States, UK, and elsewhere. So, it's extraordinary that over the past few years, we've seen this sea change in how Canadians view China. And I think, notwithstanding the Trudeau government's, predispositions to a stronger bilateral relationship with China, I think the political costs of pursuing that are extraordinarily high. And we'll see the Canadian government move in the direction of working with the United States on these series of key issues with respect to confronting China. And I think that'll manifest itself in some of the issues that Clark has raised. I think there's kind of growing interest in Canada around the idea of a economic NATO, whereby to solve for the asymmetry that we have in our relationship with China, China can take action against Canada, and because of our size, there are limits on our ability to retaliate. And so, I know that the idea of extending the kind of principle of veto to the economic sphere is something of interest in certain Canadian policy circles. We had Parliament unanimously endorse a motion in recent days condemning the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. And so I just think you're seeing a kind of a growing hawkishness in Canada vis-a-vis China. And one hopes that manifests itself in a more positive and constructive way in working with the United States to deal with issues around supply chains and collaboration on energy, on climate, on science and technology, and so on. I guess in sum, if I could leave one point with the group, I do think that that the state of the Canada-China relationship has pushed Canadians who tend to have a kind of nascent anti-Americanism much more in the direction of our bilateral relationship with Canada, with the United States rather. And I think the question for policymakers, business leaders, civil society is how do we seize that moment to re-energize and reinvigorate our bilateral relationship.
And I think the United States, obviously what the Trump administration did with respect to folks jailed was pretty shameful. But if there's any silver lining there, it's that it wasn't just Canada, right? Like the United States, the Trump administration went silent on human rights in Hong Kong and protecting Hong Kong. And, basically on the Uyghur issue, there was the famous line that Trump would not criticize that publicly because, we were working on this phase 1 trade agreement. Like if you think that the United States has traditionally been sort of the leader of the post-war liberal order, you have an obligation to stand up for human rights. You have an obligation to defend the rule of law. Sometimes commercial concerns need to take a secondary consideration to that. The Trump administration wanted to broker soy to the Chinese, which, you can argue about the economic merits of that, but I really do think that there is a black eye for the United States. And one of the things I'm really hopeful for coming from the Biden administration is to start repairing that. And then you can get into the secondary, second order concerns about, dealing with Buy American or these other concerns, right? Dairy trade. But ultimately, the United States needs to stand up and defend the rule of law and the liberal order that I think paid dividends for both the United States and Canada. I'm really hopeful that we're going to get back to that.
Got sort of an off-the-ball question for both of you, and I caution this by telling everybody I did not prepare them for this question. So in preparing for this, I ran across something about the National Technology and Innovation Board, and it's my understanding this was something that had been proposed by Senator McCain. So it goes a little ways back, but it was sort of this idea we've been talking about resilience, and I guess it really kind of goes towards we've talked about semiconductors and the idea of jointly producing sort of a minimal amount of the items that we need as a modern society, collaborating on technology and so forth. But this was a concept that included not only the US and Canada, but also the UK and Australia. Do you hear of any talk along those lines, that particularly as you see the UK, with Brexit moving out of the EU, do you see much of a talk of, I don't want to use the word Commonwealth, but do you see sort of any more talk of, since we're not in TPP now as the United States, is there any bilateral move, particularly among the Biden administration, or maybe sort of people sort of aligned with the Biden administration through think tanks and such? Is there any much talk about sort of thinking along these lines of how we can build this type of resilience among our allies?
John, you want to take that?
I'm afraid I can't speak to the kind of salience of that idea in the U.S., Doug, but I can say that there is a considerable interest in Canada. In effect, what you're talking about is taking our Five Eyes information sharing kind of model and expanding it into a broader set of realms, including the commercial realm. And I think there'd be a tremendous amount of interest in that in Canada. There is, for instance, some talk of pursuing the idea of a CANZIC trade agreement. So this is Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. What really does amount to a kind of reinvigorated Commonwealth. But the one missing partner in that from the Five Eyes, of course, is the United States. And so Boris Johnson's talked about something called the D10, particularly in the area of digital infrastructure or digital technology. I think these are precisely the types of questions we need to be asking ourselves in the aftermath of the pandemic and this kind of renewed interest around reshoring and domestic productive capacities. There has to be limits on how far we go, as Clark says. We need to have a framework to be able to distinguish between truly strategic capacities and kind of nice to haves, that one could envision kind of falling victim to the process of rent seeking. But I think, Doug, that your question is bang on. How do we build on some of these pre-existing institutional models like the Five Eyes to strengthen a relationship amongst a group of countries that have, common values, common commercial interests, and common geopolitical interests?
I think that's exactly right. I wrote down the 5 I's right as Doug was asking the question. I think that's right. I think information sharing and again, getting into my broader concerns about the relationship with China, it really is at that nexus of high technology and high tech production, national security, and trade. And so I do think that does present a nice model, at least intellectually, for people to be thinking about how deeply we need to be moving and to integrating the trade in those technology, high tech products. Because if you think about it, the countries that are involved in the 5 I's, and if you threw in those with whom we share sort of liberal values, so the EU, you could throw in a country like Taiwan, that are sort of democratic, capitalist, open societies. Thinking through how closely you want to partner on some of these really strategic products makes sense, and if you can do that in a productive way, I think that makes a lot of sense. It just, again, I don't want this to become a pretext for more protectionism where, oh my gosh, we're concerned about X, Y, and Z. If you're concerned about those things, that's fine, but rely on those with whom we share values, and we can, have that debate.
Yes, semiconductors, one can make a strong argument that semiconductors represent a kind of strategic capacity. I think mask production is not it's hard to argue that mask production represents a kind of strategic capacity that we need to, build protectionist barriers around.
So I know we're sort of short on time, so I want to kind of wrap it up with a couple of quick questions. I'll ask this one of Clark, and again, this is actually one that I didn't quite tee up for him, but I think he's perfectly capable of answering it on a high level. We described this as what the Biden administration means for North American trade, but we haven't talked much about Mexico. So kind of at a high level, can you, and again, I didn't tell Clark to prepare for this, but can you talk a little bit about, what we might expect to see in terms of trade between the U.S. and Mexico and how it might be different than under the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that there are existing irritants, as but again, I think that the overall posture will not be as sort of conflict centric. But the United States has concerns right now about some energy investments in Mexico, and there's potentially going to be an ISDS case surrounding that. So yeah, look, ultimately, I think that it'll be better than the Trump administration. The Biden folks are not going to be talking about immigration tariffs or shutting down the border entirely to deal with refugees and migrants. So I think that will be better. And I just generally think that their outlook on the world, hey, we're going to rely more on allies, I think is the right one. And ultimately, I think it behooves the United States and Canada to bring Mexico back more toward that sort of the U.S. Canadian view of the world. If you look back at the history of NAFTA, Mexico in the 90s was in this really weird spot, right? Because half the country sort of wanted to integrate more with the United States and with Canada, and then the sort of reactionary, very far left wanted to integrate with Cuba and sort of socialist countries. And it was a tremendous success story of NAFTA that we were able to integrate Mexico more toward the United States and the Canadian liberal democracy, market-centric view of the world. And so anything we can do to continue to strengthen that, because there are left-wing polls toward, what I think are dictatorships and really ugly communist and socialist regimes in Latin America.
So sort of as a final question, this one's for Sean, and I'm reading, Tobias had previously asked the viewers if they had questions, and we had a few questions about oil. And it occurs to me that, particularly for the benefit of American viewers. Sean, could you, and again, I didn't prepare Sean for this, but I think you can certainly talk about it. Could you talk a little bit at a high level, talk about the state of the energy industry, particularly in Alberta, and in doing so, talk about how important Keystone really is to Canada and to the energy industry in Canada, and then if Keystone is blocked, what are the alternatives? What are the options?
It's a great question. I'm afraid that I'm quite bearish about the state of oil and gas development in Canada. I don't say that gleefully, Doug. We've talked about this in the past, that the province of Alberta, which has been such a source of economic activity and job creation in the country, is facing a set of challenges. Some of them reflect, global energy markets and so on, but a big part of it is Canada's political economy. What participants probably know is that virtually any major energy infrastructure project in the country, either under construction or at some stage in conception or application, runs through contested, what we call indigenous, what you might call Indian territory, and that's been the subject of both litigation and kind of a slow, laborious process of negotiation on different forms of economic participation in those projects. Some of those, in some cases, that process has some promise. There are some progressive indigenous communities that see resource development as fundamental to the economic and social well-being of their citizens. But I'm afraid that there are many who don't. And so, even if you set aside, Doug, some of the environmental regulations and climate-related policies that the Trudeau government has imposed on the oil and gas sector, I actually don't think that they're even the most fundamental obstacles to the expansion of Alberta's oil sands development to address global demand in oil and gas. I think Canada has chosen, for a whole host of historic and political reasons, not to address the elephant in the room, which is we need to solve these issues around indigenous rights, indigenous participation in oil and gas, or we're going to have our resources landlocked. The Trudeau government is poised to pass legislation that would bring into Canadian law the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and there is I think a great concern in our energy sector that this will, in effect, establish a veto on energy projects to affected Indigenous communities. And I'm afraid I'm not the bearer of good news on the state of Canada's energy sector and how we break out of these kind of difficult constitutional and political economy questions about how to develop our resources in a way that meets kind of our environmental goals, but also addresses the difficult legal and constitutional position of Canada's Indigenous communities.
Clark, you know me, I like to end things on a positive note. I don't have a question. I'm turning to you. I can't let Sean have the last word after that. Give me some positive viewpoint on what 2021 is going to mean for trade.
I think it's going to come roaring back. I mean, the positive here is that we developed a vaccine for COVID, and I think that the pandemic has really depressed the economies and has sort of been a weight around the leg of the economy. I think we're slated to take off, and so that would be the note of optimism I would leave everyone on. I think trade volumes will start to spike, and I think things are going to get back to normal here within about the next 6 months. So,
here.
Well, I want to
Sure.
thank both Sean and Clark for being part of the panel today, and thank all the viewers for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this, on March 25th, we're having another panel, and this one's going to be on cross-border mergers and acquisitions and private equity investment. So we hope that you will join us for that as well. And thank you all for participating today.
Thanks, Doug.
Yes, thank you very much to everybody. I greatly appreciate it. Like Doug mentioned, please consider that event the 25th at 12:30. We'll send invites out. I also wanted to thank, we had Rachel McCormick, Consul General of Canada on this, joining us today, and also Vag Badawal, who is the Agent General of Ontario here in Texas. Thanks a lot to Jag and Rachel for being a part of today. Take care.
Thanks.